how will you use your power? We all have the power to shape lives. Our choices affect not only our lives, but the lives of others in society as a whole. What will your impact be? We live in a time when people are beginning to recognize that everyone has a contribution to make and that our generation has access to incredible technology with which to make our voices heard. What will your contribution be? I want to share with you some thoughts on the historically unique opportunities that we have. I hope to challenge you to consider how you will use these opportunities to impact not only yourself, but the larger social and professional communities as well. I believe that individuals have always had the power to affect not only their own life path, but that of others. In many cases, though, some have been held back by such factors as cultural stereotypes and a lack of tools with which to reach others. Both of these barriers are being broken down as we embrace changes in technology and recognize that everyone has something to contribute. As these barriers continue to fall, the real question of how we will use this power becomes even more important. My topics today are girl power and cyberbullying. They may, at first glance, appear to be unrelated, but they provide some insight into the unique opportunities we have in making empowered contributions. And they are useful in making a conscious decision about whether we will use our choices and our power to build up or tear down. As I stated earlier, we live in a time when people are beginning to recognize that everyone has a contribution to make. The changing roles of women are one example. Historically, women have been limited by social norms and stereotypes. In the U.S., this has been gradually changing with some notable gains beginning in the 1950s. At that time, women were beginning to recognize their ability to break out of the traditional roles that they had long been expected to play. According to Dewson and Sheldon's figures, in 1950, 1/4 of all married women who were living with their husbands were also in the labor force. This might seem to contradict what we have been taught, but being in the workforce and being in the workforce without condemnation and guilt are not the same thing. Many factors have contributed to the perception of a woman's place being in the home, and that the guilt might have accompanied women who joined the workforce. Along with all of the pressures we might imagine, an excerpt of PBS's The American Experience documents the inclusion of women's roles in the propaganda at this time. Having a wife and mother in the home was promoted as an important positive difference between the USA and communism during the Cold War era. It is clear that women faced strong pressure to tend home and hearth, putting their roles as wife and mother ahead of any personal ambition that they might have had. Nevertheless, attitudes were shifting. Portrayals in the media of the time still heavily supported the traditional roles, but in her article, Look at Me, I'm Sandra Dee, Georganne Shiners notes that there's conflicting messages, which is another indicator that attitudes were beginning to change. Shiner states that in portraying the problems and tensions of teenage girls, Dee helped to expose the contradictions that were inherent within this double standard. With this groundwork, the acceptance of a change in women's roles continued to gain momentum over the next 40 years. Changing status of American women, Van Deusen and Sheldon include stats between 1954 and 1969 that the number of the female heads of households increased by 40%. By 1974, female-headed households were 10% of all the households that were in the United States. Of course, opportunities and acceptance were still limited, but progress was being made towards recognizing and accepting that women can make valuable contributions to society beyond the previous limits. By the 1990s, a new term, girl power, was coined for a branch of the movement by which then was gaining both momentum and participants. In the 2006 article entitled Between Girl Power and Reviving Ophelia, Constituting the Neoliberal Girl, Gannett describes the original term as being associated with a group of women whose organization was based on a civil rights movement. These goals included establishing an identity that was separate from the status quo, which still had somewhat rigid expectations for women. Early on, only a few women seemed to identify with the notion of girl power. It was adopted primarily by young white women who had associations with those who identified as queer or a punk attitude. They celebrated their preferences in fashion and engaged in political expression. Although those of us in our 20s were blissfully unaware of the history and struggle behind it, we may remember the all-girl bands that personified the movement at the time. How many of us can still name all of the members of the Spice Girls? Over time, the term girl power has taken on a new meaning. It continues to evolve, and Gonick notes that girl power names a complex of cultural phenomenon and social positionings for young women that is neither coherent or fixed. Her work lends to support the idea that we are beginning to see that women can make valuable contributions, but there are still barriers that need to be addressed. She argues that one such barrier that may arise from the conflicting ways in which women are viewed by themselves and others. Are women as strong and independent as the feminist position states? Or do we still feel the vulnerability and powerlessness described by Gonick and others in the Ophelia mindset? While I suspect that there is truth into both of these descriptions, I see that technology is an avenue by which women and others can approach their full potential. An example of this was explored in Salter's 2007 article entitled Girl Power, Fast Company, which documented how teenager Ashley Quayles used the internet and social media to create her own online business. Quayles recognized a niche specializing in internet businesses for the MySpace page. She used this to design pages that were particular to the girls her age. With the technology being new, the playing field was somewhat level when compared to other types of businesses. In fact, in some ways, Ashley had an advantage as a member of the target market who had direct experience in what might appeal to teenagers using the MySpace site. By the early age of 17, she had dropped out of school and was taking online classes to continue her education. She was also earning impressive paychecks and was able to buy her own house. Her example is notable as she has shown the ability to respond to new opportunities as they rise. As cell phones have increased in popularity, she also expanded her business to include wallpapers for phones. In her case, technology was the means by which she overcame the barriers of youth and gender to achieve economic success. She used her power to turn what began as a hobby into a career. Salter's concluding comment describing Ashley's story as being about a 17-year-old and her big dreams in a pink world full of promise reinforces the fact that while progress has been made, we still have a ways to go. Perhaps our choices will help further the dream of technology and will most definitely play a role. Along with the MySpace world, we have some other media that has also talked about girl power. We've noticed more in films. We've also seen women stepping up and taking the roles. Everybody will remember the movie Devil Wears Prada, but a more recent Anne Hathaway film, The Intern, also puts a young woman in the role of an entrepreneur building her own business with the help from no other person. This shows us that technology is a great tool with seemingly limitless power. It changes the way we interact with the world and provides a platform for the ever-changing roles for all of us. The second idea that comes with technology, however, is that like any tool, it can be used for either a positive or a negative effect.